Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webcast, The Foundations of Successful Reference Data Management. I'm Robert Coyne. I'm Vice President of Professional Services and one of the three co-founders of TopQuadrant, and I'm pleased today to be able to introduce the program and the speakers. First, we have Malcolm Chisholm, who has over 25 years of experience in data management. He's an expert consultant and a thought leader in reference and master data management and data governance. Malcolm is also a well-known presenter at conferences in the U.S. and Europe and has authored several books, including Managing Reference Data in Enterprise Databases. Malcolm will start giving an overview of the importance and challenges associated with reference data management and governance. He'll highlight some areas of best practices, including, importantly, what capabilities to look for in a reference data solution. Bob DuCharme will follow. Bob is a semantic solutions architect at TopQuadrant. He works with our customers on requirements and implementation. Bob is also the author of several books, including O'Reilly's Learning Sparkle. This is the only book devoted to the semantic web query language. Bob will give a brief overview today of TopRaid Reference Data Manager, TopQuadrant's newest solution offering. And with guidance from Malcolm, it was designed specifically to address core capabilities needed to support modern reference data management solutions. So let's go over a few logistical items before we get started today. Please feel free to ask questions as we go along using your GoToWebinar controls. To ask questions, if you look at your control panel on the right-hand side, you should see a drop-down box for questions. If you click on the box, you should be able to post a question at any time during the presentation. And we will address as many questions as time allows at the conclusion of the webinar. Just want to assure everyone that we will also be recording today's webinar, and we'll send a link to the recorded version to everyone. Finally, in the GoToWebinar window, you should see a view menu at the top of your control panel. If you click and select full screen view, you should have the best view of all that we're going to show. So let's begin the program. First, I just wanted to give you a very quick snapshot of TopQuadrant. For those of you who do not know, TopQuadrant is a semantic data integration company. We offer standards-based solutions so that data can be organized, shared, and exchanged regardless of its structure, origin, or location. Since its founding in 2001, our company has always had the focus of harnessing emerging technology to build practical but innovative business applications. And we continue today to our strong commitment to standards-based approaches to data semantics with the mission of making enterprise information meaningful. TopQuadrant offers a variety of solutions for data integration and metadata management. Many of these solutions are in use in a wide range of industries, as shown by this sampling of our enterprise customers that you see below. All TopRaid solutions are built on a standards-based platform for data representation, models, and queries. And this supports model-driven flexibility throughout, and that in turn provides easy configuration and extension as your needs evolve. So many changes and much of the maintenance can be done by users with minimal involvement from IT. As mentioned, in part 2, Bob DuCharme will give a brief tour of some of the key capabilities of TopRaid Reference Data Manager, which you see on the bottom of the screen. So now, just before we go to Malcolm, we want to start with a quick poll, and here it is. To respond, you can just select the option that best describes your organization's current reference data management approach. And we're just going to give everyone a short while, a few more seconds here to respond. Okay, yeah, with over 70% of people responding, here are the results. And now I'm going to pass it over to you, Malcolm,
Thank you very much, Robert. So I'd like to start by putting reference data in context. This is very important because if we don't understand what reference data is, then reference data management projects are at risk from difficulties with understanding scope and managing expectations. So reference data very broadly is codes and lookups, these tables that have a couple of columns, 20 to maybe a couple of hundred rows usually, and they are structurally not very exciting, but they are very, very important. And when you get into them, there's a lot more that has to be done with them, and they're a very rich area in need of governance and management. But we need to understand where reference data fits with other kinds of data, and in this slide I try to put reference data in its context. Other kinds of enterprise information include metadata, and by metadata here I mean it in a rather narrow sense, which is the data that specifies tables and columns in a database, or attributes and entities and relationships in a data model, of course. The kind of metadata that specifies other data. We expect this metadata to be stable for the entire lifespan of a production database. If there's a data quality problem with it, we have to restructure the database, and that can cause all kinds of problems. If we change, let's say, customer last name from 30 bytes to 40 bytes, there'll be programs, files, reports, all kinds of things that have to be changed, and it's an enormous impact. But perhaps most importantly, metadata has meaning. It has semantics, and this semantic content is also something that reference data has. And I would actually submit that reference data contains more semantics than traditional data modeling metadata, which is again the definitions of tables, columns, entities, attributes. So reference data shares that meaning with metadata. It also shares the very high per value data quality importance. You really need to have zero data quality defects with reference data, and making sure that happens is part of the challenge of reference data management. So reference data again is what is commonly called code tables, lookup tables, domain values. I think it's better to think of it though in terms of its semantics that can be adjusted after the production databases go live and are to some extent under user control, whereas the metadata is a bit more static. Transaction structure data, by contrast, describes the parties to the transactions of the enterprise. Traditionally, these are things like customer and product. Our enterprises have activities such as sales. Well, if you want to sell something, you have to know who the customer is and what the product is that you're selling. And this is really the domain of master data. And with master data, you have the issue of identity resolution. Is customer X the same as over here, the same as customer Y over there? It's managing identities. Semantics doesn't enter into the equation here. So we can already see there's a big distinction between transaction structure data and reference data, and hence between reference data management and master data management. And as I was saying earlier, it's important to scope your reference data projects and manage expectations for success. So it's really important to understand this. Then we have enterprise structure data, which is the data that allows us to report business activity by business responsibility, such as chart of accounts and organization structure. These tend to resemble reference data somewhat, and some people class them together. The thing about enterprise structure data is the hierarchical issues that it has, historical hierarchies, and dealing with those, like, reporting last year's credit for product lines using this year's organization structure, something like that. Then we have transaction activity data, which is the traditional sales, employee actions, trades, etc., that the operational systems of the enterprise pump out every day. These have always been the focus of IT. They're the focus of the need for performance and for scale. And if we have data quality problems at this level, yes, it's true that it will affect a transaction. It might be a big transaction in terms of importance to the enterprise, but it'll be limited to that transaction. Whereas we saw with reference data, if there's a data quality problem with reference data, say a currency code, it can have extremely widespread effects. And then finally we have transaction audit data, which is the kind of data that tracks the state changes of the transaction. And this is what you see in web logs, database logs, and so on. So as we go down this scale, we see increasing volume of data, population later in time, and shorter lifespan. The transaction audit data may have to be cleaned out several times a day. The metadata and some of the reference data has to last forever. So this puts reference data in context, and we can understand just what it is. The next slide I am not going to go over because it just repeats what I said, and that's there for your reference. So why is reference data important? Well, there's a lot of reasons. Data quality problems in reference data have widespread impact. I remember once I was working at a large fund manager, and their entire trading platform came down for a day when the Zimbabwe dollar went over 1 million to the US dollar. And I've seen other kind of problems that are perhaps not as pronounced or acute, but you have difficulties in terms of transaction rejection rates being as high as 20% in straight-through processing, only because of reference data's lack of synchronization between the applications involved. Then we have lack of understanding leading to bad business decisions. This is getting more and more important today. We're living in the golden age of data, and so much of our enterprise data is used for analytics. The analytics teams may not understand what the reference data means as it structures and categorizes the data. So that's an area that's actually growing in importance. The same table occurs in many different applications. This calls for efficiency of reference data management. A reason that reference data management is not done is simply that if it's done in an immature way, or if you think about doing it in an immature way, you rapidly realize that the resources needed to do it are overwhelming. You simply don't have them, therefore the reference data management doesn't get done. So let's say we have the country table or the currency table in every application of our enterprise. How are we going to keep those up to date without spending a boatload of hours every year doing it? It's going to be very difficult, and those are only two tables. Next, reference data is important because anywhere from 20 to 50% of the tables in a database are reference data. The more abstract the data model, the more you're going to have in terms of reference data tables, and those have to be kept up to date and synchronized, and that's quite difficult to do, again, if you don't have a mature reference data governance and reference data management methodology. Next is one of my least favorite things, which is the unnecessary and difficult mappings for data integration. Again, we live in the golden age of data. We want to reuse all the data that the enterprise creates and data we bring in from outside. How do we integrate that in our MDM hubs, in our BI environments? Well, it's not easy, and a great source of difficulty comes from reference data which is poorly understood and therefore difficult to map. You can't get to the semantic mappings of the reference data because you don't fully understand it and it's non-standardized. So this is, again, a critically important area. Tremendous amount of work goes on in these mapping exercises, the resources of which would be better invested in proper reference data governance and management in the first place. And then lastly, we need it in a general sense to understand the world outside the enterprise. That is how the world of things that the enterprise does not manage, like countries and currencies and industry codes, that's how it's represented inside the enterprise. And we need that to connect more broadly to regulators, to the industry as a whole, to investors, to suppliers, even customers, and so on. And then lastly, this aspect of reference data having the job of turning base data into business information. We categorize our data with reference data and we can make sense out of it. To some extent, all tables are denormalized in databases, and it's the reference data that enables us to extract meaningful business views. If we don't do that well, we can't extract that business information. So, having seen why reference data is important, what are we going to do about it? Well, I strongly recommend in large enterprises having a central reference data management unit. This is a unit that's solely dedicated to the governance and management of reference data. It doesn't mean it's managing all of the reference data, and in fact I recommend a federated governance model to allow internal reference data, that's reference data produced inside the enterprise, to be managed by SMEs and data managers. But anyway, why do we need a specialized unit? Because, as we've just seen, reference data has unique properties that are not shared by other classes of data. You can't use a one-size-fits-all data management or data governance approach when it comes to reference data. Reference data has unique challenges. Again, these are not going to be solved by a one-size-fits-all data management or data governance approach. And then reference data has unique risks, such as the misunderstandings leading to miscodings. So that shows that we need specialization. So why centralization? Well, there's going to be a need for standardization. For instance, if we agree that a country code table is needed, which one are we going to use? The US GENC, the ISO Alpha 2, the ISO Alpha 3, maybe the UN numeric codes. What are we going to standardize on? They all have their pros and cons, actually, so there is some skill needed in making the choices there, and it becomes more difficult as we have to go out and discover standards. So then we need one place in the enterprise to deal with external authorities, such as ISO, such as you know, as the example is here, how do we get the NAICS codes? That's the North American Industrial Classification System, which is controlled, at least in the United States, by the White House. You have to go to the White House to get in the line to get those updates. Then we have the need to set up governance for internal reference data management. So the external reference data is the reference data that's produced by authorities outside of the enterprise. The internal reference data is the data, and there's a great deal of it, that's produced inside the enterprise, such as customer type and product line. How are those managed? How are those governed? And so if you need somebody to set the rules of the road and describe the practices for management and enforce those practices, hence the need for centralization. So, sorry, let me just go into governing and managing external reference data. It's sometimes thought this is a rather simple process. That is not the case. The central reference data unit will have to think about things like discovering external standards, and you don't know what you don't know. The profiling the authority, finding out who to interact with, what the ways in which that authority works, are the legal agreements. Some of these authorities require paid subscriptions, others do not. And then you have to profile the source data set. That is incredibly important. Unfortunately, in my experience, the data sets that are produced externally don't look like the reference data tables that we expect in the enterprises. There's a good deal of extract, transform, and load and enrichment that has to go on, and source data profiling is part of that. The other part is onboarding the data set, which is the initial ingestion. And my experience is that you have to write onboarding guides for each data set you onboard to track what you did in terms of, or you want to do in terms of the extract, transform, load, and enrichment. Once you've done the initial ingestion, then there's ongoing management. Updates will be released. Sometimes they're deltas, sometimes there's point releases from these authorities. Subscription management is a big deal, and monitoring those releases and getting them across into the enterprise is something that the reference data unit has to do. And then finally there's periodic reconciliation. Maybe you're going to miss an update. You have to reconcile back to the external authority once in a while to make sure that you have got the full set of reference data. So these are just some of the tasks in managing external reference data that a central reference data unit will need to carry out. Now let's look at governing and managing internal reference data. Well, it might be thought, okay, with internal reference data like customer type or product line, we have SMEs and data managers across the enterprise and they'll just do the work for us. It's true that the SMEs and the data managers are out there, but they need to be governed. They need to produce reference data in a standard manner through a standard process, particularly involving things like consulting all stakeholders. They can't just, invent new reference data that might cause somebody a problem, might have some negative impact. Therefore, the central reference data unit must develop common practices and enforce those practices. That might also include policies for the internal reference data producers and make sure that they are living up to them. If the accountabilities, I should also say that the accountabilities are sometimes not even enforced. The reference data managers may produce an initial reference data table, but then never do an update after that, and never review what they've done and say, yes, this still matches the needs of the enterprise. So there's wide scope for good governance in this area from the central reference data unit, even if the management is being done elsewhere in the enterprise. Operational environments can be particularly tricky because the operations staff are often tasked with limited resources to deal with increased volumes of data and meet that with increased timeliness. The danger that is faced in the operational environments is that they will change in their applications the reference data in an ungoverned manner. And this then flows down into the analytic environments and wreaks havoc there. So it's important to have good governance, not just of internal reference data producers, but of operational environments, so that they don't play games with the environment, with the reference data, but at the same time taking note of the difficulties that operations are encountering and making sure those are dealt with in a well-governed manner in terms of reference data. So there's a lot of scope for good governance in this area too. Now I'd like to say a little bit about the technical environments. Traditional reference data hubs have worked based on the idea of gathering reference data from transaction applications, cleansing it and integrating it, and maybe having data stewards produce reference data inside the hub. And the hub will then distribute the reference data to consuming applications. So the hub is, as it were, used for both the production of reference data and the distribution of reference data. However, as shown in this slide, I think the better approach today is what I call the farm and market approach, which is to farm your reference data, and when it's ready for the market, take it to the market, which is the hub, and distribute it from there. That allows the reference data production areas to have their own data models, which are much more suited to the production of reference data than what the consumers actually want. If you want to onboard a new fund, for instance, if you're a fund manager, you're going to have to jump through all kinds of legal hurdles to do that, and that's reflected in the very complex workflow in your production area. But when the fund is created, it might be a single record with a single code and description, and we just need that's all that needs to be seen by the consumers. So the data models are different for the producers and the consumers. So we have distinct farms for reference data, albeit in the same physical environment. They're logically separated, sending production-ready data to the market, and there's no need for state control in the hub. The consuming applications can take it with no worries. So I think this is the better architecture. And then finally, I'd like to summarize the capabilities to consider in solutions. And these are, I think, fundamental capabilities that solution providers should have. So profiling an external authority, profiling an external reference data set, supporting semantic analysis of each element in a reference data set, and documenting that semantic analysis, particularly so that all stakeholders in the enterprise can view it, importing reference data into a repository, assigning accountabilities for reference data management tasks, tracking changes to reference data, and supporting distribution of reference data. There are other capabilities, but I think these are the most fundamental ones, and you know that this is a good set to consider when you're looking at solutions. And with that, Robert, I'd like to pass it back to you.
Thanks, Malcolm. Before we continue, let's take a brief pause in the program for another quick poll. And again, here it is. Please select as many options as you like to indicate what tools you use today for reference data management. And we'll give everyone 20, 30 seconds for this. Okay, thank you for your input, and here are the results. Lots of homegrown systems, it seems, there. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bob for part 2.
Thank you, Robert. Earlier, Malcolm described these core capabilities to consider, and we worked with Malcolm to incorporate these into a single integrated tool that we call TopRate Reference Data Manager, or TopRate RDM. TopRate RDM lets work groups of people in different roles collaborate to make the governance, maintenance, and especially the use of reference data easier. It's a web-based system that works from any browser. One broad requirement of TopRate RDM that encompasses all others is the need to manage the wide array of reference data that exists for all the different governance and management needs. RDM is especially good at metadata management because we found that efficient management of reference data metadata helps you to get more value out of your reference data. Many different people in an enterprise can benefit from TopRate RDM: subject matter experts, database administrators, business analysts, and more. Today we're going to focus on data stewards. Data stewards are responsible for the overall governance of reference data sets and need the ability to efficiently perform all of the tasks shown here. So we're going to take a look at TopRate RDM from the perspective of someone with a data governance task. Here we see the reference sets. We're looking at TopRate RDM. We see the reference sets that already exist in this particular system. The data sets displayed on this screen are the ones that the logged in user has been granted access to. For any particular listed data set, the logged in user may have permission to edit it, or maybe only permission to view and search it. For these data sets, we've granted levels of access that would be typical for a data steward. Let's take a look at the airports data set. I've mentioned how RDM stores metadata about the data set itself in addition to reference data. This lets users get much more value out of the reference data. Metadata is where we document the semantic analysis that Malcolm discussed. It's where we capture the meaning of the data. It's this kind of meaning that enables you to use the data more intelligently. Here we see the various properties that the reference data will store about airports and what the meaning is of each property. This is just one kind of metadata that RDM stores. For example, we have details about what an IATA code is, as well as descriptions of the other properties. Also, notice that the ISO country is a related entity to our main entity, airport. This is a connection from the airport's data set to a different data set. And this ability to connect different data sets is one of TopRate RDM's great strengths. We'll come back to this later when we see how the countries in the ISO country data set will be automatically linked when we import airport data. For now, the airport's data set that this metadata describes is currently empty. Let's go to the Import tab and see how the actual airport reference data can be brought in from an Excel spreadsheet and saved in this airport reference data set. Take a look at the spreadsheet. We see a list of airports, the cities they're in, countries. Country codes is an important one. That's a classic code list, IATA codes, latitude, longitude, and altitude. Okay. So RDM offers several ways to import from external data sources. Spreadsheets are a very common source, not only because people often store data in spreadsheets, but also because data from relational databases can easily be exported to spreadsheets. There are several common patterns for representing reference data in spreadsheets. The third choice on this tab, Import Spreadsheet Using Pattern, lets us pick from a selection of common patterns to guide the import process. This second choice, Import Spreadsheet Using Template, I'll tell you more about that shortly. For now, we're going to import the spreadsheet using a common pattern. Browse, get my Excel spreadsheet I was showing you earlier. Each row in it is going to be treated as representing an airport. So RDM reads in the first few rows of the spreadsheet, we see them at the bottom here, and shows it at the bottom of this Select Spreadsheet Type screen so that we can more easily identify the pattern used to represent the data. RDM can import hierarchical data, but as we can see, this data is a flat list, so I'm going to select No Hierarchy. The next screen of the Import Wizard asks us which columns of the spreadsheet should be used to populate which properties of the reference data set. The target property drop-down list shows us the properties defined as part of the reference datasets model. So I'm going to map airport to label. Label's a very common property to show like the basic name of the thing. I'll map city to the airport city column. I'm going to skip country because we've got country code here, and we're going to see that it does something interesting with that. IATA code has its own property, so does latitude and longitude. Altitude we see does not have a property right now, so for now we won't be able to import it, and we'll see something we can do about that later. If we had a lot of spreadsheets with the same structure to import, we wouldn't have to fill out this same screen every time. We could fill out a name here where it says make this a reusable mapping at the bottom, and then the next time we're going to import a spreadsheet with the same structure, instead of me picking the third choice that I picked, import spreadsheet using pattern, I would pick that second choice that we saw, import spreadsheet using template. That would show any of the reusable mapping templates that have been defined on this screen after filling out the parameters of for importing a particular spreadsheet. So it's all done. Let's take a look at the airport's data, and we see the data from the spreadsheet all lined up there. If we select a particular row, we can see more data about it. We can not only see the various codes that were there, but airport country, remember we mapped the, go back to the spreadsheet here, the country code to that. What it's showing is it replaced the full country name for the country code, and we still have the country codes, we'll see in a second. It would put the full country name in there and also turned it into hypertext links to the relevant data. I can follow the link to United States of America. We can see not only the original country code, additional country codes, the name in several different languages, metadata about the country code itself, additional information about the United States, and we can navigating with a hypertext link, we can use any browser's back button to go back to the original one. This ability to connect data sets is one of RDM's great strengths. For example, the country data set might be reused by multiple ones. This airport one is using it. A completely different application that needs to know about countries might be able to use it. And this addresses one issue Malcolm brought up of avoiding the use of the same list in multiple places, because that gets into maintenance issues of maintaining them all at the same time. RDM's user interface is pretty simple, and you can always mouse over the various icons to see what they do. Here we see the icons to edit a row, to add a new row, or to delete one. I'm going to edit this one, and let's say that the Aberdeen Airport has added a few big runways and filled out the right paperwork, and now they're an international airport. And we can see there are other metadata fields that we could add to it as well for this code. So when I save it, we see that's been updated. RDM keeps track of who made what changes when. And this data is used for a lot of different things, to help work groups coordinate their work. Here's one example of how we can take advantage of it. I can see who made edits by clicking Show History here. It's showing in pink, the pink background means this value was deleted, that someone logged in with this name at this date and time, deleted it. The green shows that at the same date and time they added something. And we can see that 2 minutes earlier, these data fields were all added when I imported it. So I'm going to turn that off for now. The columns showing data up here is also something you can control. It reflects the choices shown on the search form. So if I, for example, turn off country code and say search with no other search criteria, it shows the same data but without the airport country. Now I'm going to do a real search. I'm going to have it search for anything with a airport country of United States. So I type UNI and it's showing me all the valid values for there, so I don't have to type in the whole name. I'm going to execute the search. And we have the beginning of a list of just the airports in the United States. Now I can save this search. I'm going to call it U.S. airports. And saving search has several nice advantages. One, if another data entry person tonight added a new United States airport and I came in tomorrow, I could open up my list of saved searches, run that search, and I would see it reflected without me filling out the search form. And this was a pretty simple search. But there are some other very nice advantages to this. We can see when I select this saved search that it's showing a service URL. That means it's a URL that another system in my enterprise can make a web service call to TopRate RDM to request. Let's say I had some application that every now and then needed an updated list of U.S. airports. It could use this URL as a web service call. So essentially, someone saving a search, someone who may never heard of the idea of web services, is defining a web service that other systems can call. And the web service has various parameters so that you can, for example, set the format to be something other than comma-separated values. The third thing that makes saved searches so valuable, it's for exports. If I go to the Export tab here, we see that we can export the entire reference data set in a selection of formats, and it's easy to add new formats. But we also can export a saved search, a subset defined by the saved search. So we see that U.S. airports saved search that I created before is now listed as one of the choices. So someone going to this screen could then export it in one of a variety of formats. I'm going to say I want to export the U.S. airports as tab-separated values. Firefox hands it off to Excel, and there it is. So I have a spreadsheet of the data that I just exported. Another important class of metadata that RDM stores is usage data. The usage tab lets us record and capture information about where this data set is being used. I'm going to add a record saying that the flight tracker system started using this airports data set. I'll say they started using it yesterday. They're still using it, so I'm not going to enter a usage end date. And I'm going to add a little note about it, so it's additional metadata about the relationship between the application and the data. Okay, so someone coming to the usage tab in the future will see this extra information about it. Now, another important bit of metadata that can help with some of the issues that Malcolm described is descriptions of them. For example, let's say a business analyst is using this data and they see in the data what looks like FAA codes, and they're wondering if the results of the saved search has the FAA codes that a particular system might need for sending out emergency notifications about particular airports. If I go to the reference data set facts here, we can see this description that was added. IATA codes should not be confused with FAA identifiers of U.S. airports. Most of them agree, but some do not. So this is a good example of how, a classic potential reference data management problem where two data sets seem to line up, but they don't completely line up. There are potential cracks for things to fall through, and features like this make it easy to identify those potential cracks. And if it was emergency notification of airport, you don't want anything falling through cracks. It makes it easier to prevent these kinds of mistakes. I'm going to edit this metadata here and add an additional fact. The plus sign with these fields gives us an opportunity to add additional values for any of them. So I'm going to say the letter Q, C for before I save that, I wanted to show another dataset status. There are all kinds of metadata fields we can keep track of here. Is external dataset. Malcolm described situations like this one where my enterprise, let's say, is using airport codes, but we're certainly not making them up and editing them. It comes from an external source. So keeping track of that fact is important. I might also want to keep track of, for example, subscription information about this external source, where it came from, how often it's updated, how we get a new one. We don't see any metadata about that now, but I'm going to save changes. And so when we edit again, now that the dataset status is set that it's an external dataset, we see subscription is here. We see relevant metadata about external datasets, the standards body, who maintains it, access payment type, change frequency, the kinds of things you'd want to keep track of about a external dataset. And this is just one example. TopRate RDM is intelligent enough to know, based on certain metadata settings, such as whether a given reference data set is external or not, which other metadata settings should be available to users. Now, what if the system using this requires additional information that's not there? For example, let's say I have a weather tracking system and it wants to know the altitude of each airport because that's related to barometric pressure and things like that. Well, we saw that altitude data is part of the spreadsheet over on the right here, but it was not part of the data model, the ontology that we were importing the data into. So what is an ontology? Well, the meaning and use of reference data in an organization depends on knowing how it relates to concepts that are important to an organization, relationships between those concepts, and properties, or what we know about those concepts. Together, this set of concepts, relationships, and properties is called a business model or ontology. TopRate RDM lets a data steward adjust the ontologies used by the reference data sets to integrate new reference data and to make it available throughout the enterprise with no need for help from IT staff. So the ontology being used to set up the airport's reference data set is this enterprise ontology. We can see that for ontologies as well, RDM can keep track of lots of kinds of metadata. What I'm going to do is go in and look at the ontology itself, and we'll see it keeps track of, or it has several classes of things: market identifier codes, attributes there, and there's our airports one. And we can see that for airports, it's keeping track. Airport city, this is where the fields we saw in the import came from. Airport country, latitude, longitude, nothing for altitude, so I'm going to add something for altitude. Oops, I meant to say not an object property, which is about relationships between codes, but a data type property, altitude. And I'm going to add a little bit of metadata about the altitude. I'll say distance from sea level in km. In kilometers. I'll say it's an integer so that TopRate RDM only allows values that are integers. Okay, so now when we go back and look at airports, because it's using that model, it's dynamically updated so that when we say we want to edit the airport's metadata, we can see there is a column for altitude. It's not showing on the grid here because it's not checked here, because as I mentioned, that's what makes the column show up. There are no values yet, so we'll import them just like we did before. I'll go back to the Import tab, import spreadsheet using pattern. I'm going to import the same spreadsheet. Again, we know that it's not hierarchical. I want the airport information this time, and because we'll also get the IATA code, because that's how RDM knows which altitude value goes with which airport. And this one goes a little quicker because it's just importing those two columns, and then we'll be able to see how it keeps track of this data. I didn't show in the grid. We can see now how when we do edit, we can sort by grid values. So for example, let's look at altitude again. There's the altitude values. I can sort to see there's the lowest one, Astrakhan in the Russian Federation. Sort it again. We see the highest one there in Peru. Notice also in the search form there are these two fields for altitude and some of the other numeric ones. That's if we want to search for a range. If I want to list everything that's at sea level or below, we have the list there. There are a lot of other features I could show, but I think it would be better now to just give you an overview of some of the remaining features. For example, collaboration features. I mentioned how RDM tracks all changes made by everyone, making it easier for work groups to collaborate on change management. Working copies. The Working Copies feature lets users create virtual copies of a data set and edit those copies without affecting the production copy, so that a set of proposed changes can be managed through a review and approval process. This helps to prevent deployment of data that's not quite ready for prime time, while people can still review it and work on it and collaborate on it. For further workflow control, RDM also lets users assign tasks to each other and then track those tasks and their statuses. The security and permissions features let users grant different levels of permissions to each other. For example, a data steward editing the data might give a business analyst read-only access to the data. A related feature is RDM's ability to integrate with LDAP and Active Directory for single sign-on and user management. To capture roles involved in reference dataset governance, RDM lets you create what is known as a RACI matrix. This lets you assign specific users as being responsible, accountable, consulted, or informed about changes to a data set or even to an individual code. This screenshot from RDM shows an example of setting up a RACI matrix at a data set level. The lack of a plus sign next to accountable shows that there's no way to add multiple people accountable. We're going to have a single person accountable for this. We can have as many people as we wanted informed. I could plus, add 10 people who want to be informed about changes, consulted, and so forth. A couple more features. There are users can define data quality and validation rules to ensure that the data meets certain conditions. Conformance with these rules can be checked at both data entry time dynamically and in batch by running reports on constraint violations. RDM can also manage hierarchical data sets, as I mentioned when I was importing the airport's data. That was a flat list, but RDM can manage codes organized in hierarchical structures such as occupational categories or industry sectors. Crosswalks refers to RDM's ability to let you map codes in one reference data set to codes in another. This is something Malcolm also mentioned. For example, to identify correspondences between a standards bodies list of codes and your own enterprise's similar list. In addition to one-to-one mappings, RDM also supports many-to-many mappings. And finally, we saw that a saved search is assigned a URL that lets another system call that search as a web service, a RESTful web service. RDM's RESTful API offers several other ways to define web services that let other systems in your enterprise get the maximum value from RDM, because those systems can retrieve reference dataset data and metadata dynamically to enhance their own operations. For example, they could use it to populate a drop-down field on a web form with the most up-to-date list of appropriate choices. Along with the RESTful API, RDM also supports other integration mechanisms such as Enterprise Service Bus. In addition to these APIs, the TopGrade platform that we use to build RDM and other TopQuadrant products makes RDM easy to configure and customize to address any specialized requirements an organization may have, for example, the APIs. or new parts of search forms. This customization could easily be the topic of an entire separate webinar, but I think for this webinar, I think it's time to hear, or if there is any time, from our viewers about their reference data management concerns and questions. So I will pass it back to Robert.
Thank you very much, Bob and Malcolm, for those informative presentations. That brings us to the part of the webinar where we can take your questions. So if you're ready, let's see what questions we have. Here's a question, I think, for Malcolm. What advice can you give on creating a business case for reference data management? Does it vary depending on the industry or company size?
Well, actually, everybody needs reference data management, and I think you should be doing it. And if you're not doing it, you're going to be in trouble. Even if you're a small company, I've worked with small companies. I don't think you can really justify the headcount for a central reference data unit in a small company, but a way of looking at this is that if you have data modelers in your company or enterprise, you can justify people for reference data governance and reference data management because there's more semantics in reference data than there is in data models. And if you have a data architecture group, then I think you can also justify a centralized reference data management and governance unit. So I think those are a couple of pointers. I think large companies have to have the central reference data management and governance unit, and we see that today. So it's a tough call, but that's what I can think of right now.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Malcolm. And I see we have another question. This one would be for Bob. How does TopRate RDM support collaboration between different parties who manage and use reference data?
I talked a little bit. I can expand a little more on collaboration because it is especially important when you consider all the roles. One of the slides I showed showed all the potential different roles of people who might be involved. So to help them collaborate and make sure that the right people can do the things they need and the right things, no more and no less, with the data, RDM has several features. I mentioned the ability to create and assign tasks. A task could be the creation or editing of some reference data, but someone might be assigned to follow up on a particular question about it. Tasks can be assigned statuses to help you track their progress. They can be reassigned to other people. Someone can run a report on the task statuses and bring that report to a meeting. I showed a little about usage records, like how a flight tracker system was using the U.S. airports data. Knowing which people and systems are using which data sets is very valuable for efficient collaboration to identify redundancies, to add new efficiencies in how people share data. Also, for everyone to have a clear understanding of who has what roles in the maintenance and use of each data set is very important, because when people don't understand who is supposed to do what, a lot more can go wrong in attempts to keep that data properly up to date. So the RACI matrix, where you can assign people to be responsible or accountable or consulted or informed, that makes it a lot easier for not only the assignment, but for everyone to know who has which of these roles, to understand who's supposed to do what and not be sitting back and waiting for each other to do certain things. The working copies feature lets people collaborate on a set of proposed changes without affecting the production copy, the approved copy that your end users and applications are currently seeing. A single reference data set can have several working copies in progress at once without affecting the production copy. You can run a report to see the effect that putting a particular working copy into production might have. And working copies can be frozen for review along with other stages of a workflow, but RDM doesn't have a specific workflow that people have to follow, because we didn't want to make up, a one-size-fits-all workflow, because we know that wouldn't work. So you can mix and match the workflow stages and all these other features, the RACI matrices, usage records, task assignment. You can mix and match these features I've been describing to support the kind of collaboration that works best for your company. So that's a sort of whirlwind tour of collaboration features.
Okay, thank you very much, Bob. Well, we're coming near to the end of the hour, and you all submitted a large number of interesting questions, more than we can consider in this live session. We will follow up with you offline to answer other questions that were submitted. So we hope you found today's presentation valuable. As mentioned earlier in the presentation, following today's webinar, we will provide a link to the recording of this presentation as well as a link to Malcolm's new white paper, which will extend today's discussion. So thanks again to everyone for your attention and interest in today's webinar. We're going to close the program now. Have a great day.